So let me guess, you want to play Total War Pharaoh, Dynasties of course, but you don't know where to start. Well, that's why your boy Andy's here, and let's go right into it, shall we? If you're new to Pharaoh, this video is for you, as I will be going not just through the game's update, but through the game as a whole. So if you're new to Pharaoh, stick with me and we'll have some fun, and learn a thing or two. The major thing about Pharaoh is that it finally offers a full Bronze Age experience. That means that we not only get to play as the Egyptian characters, the Hatti characters, the Canaan characters, the Sea Peoples, but we finally get to play the Mesopotamians in Babylon and Assyria, and in that general area, but we also get to play the Greeks again. Agamemnon and Priam are back, Mycenae and Troy are back. However, the very interesting thing about this Dynasty update in terms of factions, perhaps even more so than the inclusion of Mesopotamia and the Aegean kingdoms, is the inclusion of a bunch of minor factions. Now, what is the difference between major factions and minor factions? The main difference is that major factions will sometimes come with certain unique buildings or starting positions with certain built monuments, for example. They will have their own unique command abilities, which means that, for example, in the case of Agamemnon, he will be able to gain a free ancillary and a native unit for the faction leader at a certain interval of turns, and this will change with every major character. So in terms of Troy, for example, the command there is that you will gain access to foreign faction units in your special recruitment. Now, we will go over what special recruitment is later, but this all means that if you're playing as a major faction, you're going to have a good time in various of these smaller ways essentially, which of course add up in the grand scheme of things, but in terms of the overall experience, they don't necessarily mean that much. And so if you're interested in one of the minor factions, for example Assyria, which is a major player in the game, or if you want to chill as Achilles, which is a minor faction, or perhaps as Odysseus, or what about Memnon in the south of Egypt? There are a ton of choices here for you now in terms of the minor factions. In fact, I think we have more minor factions than major ones all of a sudden, which is pretty cool, since I don't know the last time we had a bunch of these minor factions in a Total War game. So kudos. Lots of choice, not the biggest differences honestly. However, one major difference in terms of the paths you can take here is that if we launch the game as, say, Adad Shuma Usur of Babylon, and there we are on the map, we're also a part of the Mesopotamian power of the crown aspect, where we can, with enough legitimacy, challenge the king of Assyria, or the king of the universe as he's called, for this position, giving us, other bonuses, and the opportunity to use royal powers to gain even more powerful boons later on. We're also from the get-go part of the Mesopotamian Ancient Legacy, which gives us access to this faction-specific legacy powers, which come with different positive modifiers depending on the kingdom you're part of and which of these legacies you choose. This is the case for any of the major factions. They are part of each kingdom, whether in the Aegean, Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Hatti. Now, this is where things get interesting, because as a minor faction, in this case as Achilles, as you can see here, he's back from Troy, all ready to fight. As a minor faction, you are not yet a part officially of any of the kingdoms. That means that you don't have access to the court, and that you do not have access to any of the ancient legacies we just mentioned. However, if you wanted to join one of these kingdoms, all you have to do is own one piece of the so-called sacred land in that region. And as you can see, there's a lot of non-sacred land here. As Achilles though, we are firmly located within the Aegean royal tradition kingdom, whatever you want to call it, in this area. So from the get-go, we can join the Aegean kingdom and get all of these boons, as you can see here, at least the possibility to get them. Or we can choose to forge our own path as a minor faction. And in the case of Achilles, the path of the Marauders, which is basically predicated on conquest and not that much unity creation, let's put it that way. However, we need to begin by razing one region first. Razing a region means taking a foreign city and razing it to the ground, essentially destroying it. As you can tell then, perhaps the biggest difference between the major and minor factions is this initial choice of which path you can take or which kingdom you want to belong to. The major factions don't really get that choice, the minor factions do. But of course, no matter your faction, unless you begin at the top or even when you're at the top of the court, so let's for example see here, let's join the Aegean royal tradition here as Achilles, we only begin with 12 legitimacy, while the king has 66. In other words, we have no real chance to fight for the title of king yet, since we're small and weak and just joined this thing. And in court, we hold no court position yet, and that is a big weakness actually, since holding court positions, and now comes the court part of the tutorial if you will, gives you a bunch of bonuses. For example, the king gains elite units in special recruitment, intrigues against this position cost additional gold or regard, meaning it's harder to do intrigue against him, plots against him have a lower chance of success, which is, the same, and simply being the king gains you 20 legitimacy. You may perform intrigue against any of these characters, which is essentially a chance to get different boons. So for example, gossip is a type of intrigue that gains you regard, and there's going to be a lot of resource talks here essentially. What is regard? Regard is essentially how much leverage you have over any of the other positions on the court. So for example, the Grand Telestas, we currently have 0 regard with any of these characters. If we were to gossip with the Grand Telestas, we would gain 20 regard. But we would spend 1 court action, and you gain 1 court action per turn, which means that you should spend that action wisely. If we gossip with the Grand Telestas now, we can't assist him, which would cost not just 1 court action, but 360 gold. And since we have 550, I don't really think that's worth it on the very first turn. When we have regard with a character, we can make requests of them. So for example, if we wish to request embezzlement from the Grand Telestas, that would cost us 60 regard and 1 court action point, which means that we need to, perform intrigue with him a certain amount of time, so gossip or assist him in things, to essentially be able to bribe him into helping us. We can also use court actions to plot against people, to threaten them away from the position, to discredit them, which gives us legitimacy and lowers theirs, or to blackmail them in order to gain regard, for example. And having court actions and having regard while doing these things can also help you in actually making these go through. And what's key though is that performing actions against these various positions will enable you to gain different things. So for example, making a request of Agamemnon here will, when we have the proper regard, give us elite warriors, which are especially powerful warriors, enabling them for our recruitment from his faction. Or we can lower the recruitment cost of a specific type of unit if we want that one instead. For the Oracle position, for example, we may request entirely different things, like reduced construction cost for temples or more favor with gods. You need to consider who you want to build up that regard with and who you want to plot against at which points. Of course, these members can also plot against you if you have a position on the court. And as the Lauagetas position is open, we can actually claim it for 1 court action point and for 160 gold, and I think that's worth it honestly. As Achilles, he's now on the court, and being on the court gives us some powers, as you can see here. Additional recruitment slots, so we can actually recruit more units at a time. Armies now spread influence, and we'll get to influence later on. We get increased movement speed and melee attack for all bodyguard units, essentially making our generals more powerful. Plus we have more legitimacy now, 26, which is a doubling from last time we spoke about that. Mind now though that since we have a spot on the court, other characters on the court and anywhere else can plot against us, which means that you might have to spend your court actions or regard removing those plots if they have a decent chance of succeeding and if you're not afraid of them succeeding. That is essentially the court. However, the court will change depending on the faction. They function in the same way, but whereas, as you can see, any of the Achaean generals with enough gold and court actions may buy a vacant seat on the Aegean court, the Mesopotamian court is very different. Here, you actually need to hold certain cities to be on the court. So for example, I am currently playing as Adad Shuma Usur, the king of Babylon and the Babylonian faction. That's why we hold the king of Babylon position on the court. Nobody else can keep that even if we remove ourselves from the position. However, the King of Elam spot is open, but we cannot claim it even though we have the court actions for it and plenty of gold. We need to hold the settlement of Susa in order to become the King of Elam. Now precisely why it's vacant, I don't know. Maybe the previous king of Elam got ousted by someone. Maybe they were threatened out of the position. That's kind of the fun here. You know, things happen on this court. This is all to say though that even though the majority of what you can do here, the concepts of what you can do are the same across the factions, the possibilities vary in the details, right? So the king of Babylon will have different powers than what we had as Achilles, even though we hold the same geographical positioning on the court here. And the ways into the positions will differ as well, as we've seen. Of course, if you wish to become the king of the universe in this case, or you know, the leader of the court and the kingdom as a whole, you need to challenge the king head on through a civil war if you have enough legitimacy. In our case in Mesopotamia here, Kiplu is the king of the universe here with 111 legitimacy. We have 76. And as you can see, the realm can be in two political states. There is peace, which we have now, and there is the civil war, where a pretender has challenged the throne, tossing the realm into a civil war, which will only end when one person is king again, which is determined by legitimacy or victory in a war. To contest it though, we do not have enough legitimacy. As you can see here, to be able to contest it, we need 7 more legitimacy than we currently have. It is basically based on a percentage of the top legitimacy of the king. And you know, if you want to be the king from the get-go, just load up a game as the minor faction Assyria, and you're the king of the universe from the get-go. And as the king, you now of course have to worry about people declaring civil war on you and challenge your right on the throne. But as the king for now, we have access to certain powers here. We have regalia, which in Mesopotamia has 1 regalia per king. As Assyria, for example, which is quite unique in this case, we have access to the Thunder Mace of Ninurta, which gives the king of Assur, or whoever holds this regalia, several powers. More lethality, which makes them dangerous in combat, more influence faction-wide, and we'll get back to influence, and of course it's only available to him, as you can see here. But what is regalia? Well, regalia is actually an item you can hold, equipment if you will, and in terms of Assyria, we can use the Thunder Mace of Ninurta as a weapon. It is a weapon, it's a mace after all. As you can see here though, the Thunder Mace has a red marker over it. That means it can't be used, and in this case, it can't be used because it's not compatible with our mount. And since we have the king on a chariot mount, we need to remove the chariot before we can use the mace. Now, this is up to you of course. The mace is powerful, but if you like your general to be nimble and, you know, to be able to get out of combat fast, you might consider giving him a bow instead, which gives him missile range and, you know, missile ability, and to put him back on that chariot. That's all up to you. But just know that the regalia is a powerful tool, and it changes per court as well. And for example, in the Aegean court, which in this playthrough, Agamemnon has decided to declare a civil war on me, Troy, how dare he, right? We have several other regalias here open to different people. For example, the Hephaestion shield is available to a pretender or the Wanax. In this case, Wanax is the native word for a king in the Aegean. We also have Athena's Aegis, which is available to just the sitting Wanax. And then we have Ares Aspis, which also is available to a pretender or Wanax who controls the city of Mycenae. In this case then, since Agamemnon is a pretender, he has access to this now since he controls Mycenae. Now since Athena's Aegis is illuminated here, that's the regalia we have chosen to use. And we can only use 1 at a time, by the way. However, in this case, and contrary to Mesopotamia, Athena's Aegis is not a weapon, but it is a shield. And in this case, it gives us better replenishment bonus, it grants the ability to cause fear in enemy units, and it grants the encourage ability, which, you know, gives our own units a morale boost. In other words, this is a very different type of equipment from the one in Mesopotamia. And this goes for every faction, of course, from Egypt to Hatti. Everywhere is different, but the concepts are the same. What is very interesting about Pharaoh's court system though, is the concept of royal powers. And this is where the long game comes in, because royal powers and their openings are predicated on legitimacy and having a lot of it. In this case, we have 99 legitimacy, which is fairly high, but it's not enough to open up even the first tier of royal powers. Now, royal powers can give you massive boons in this game. For example, this first tier has 5 different types of royal powers. The court presence means that we can fill out 2 out of the 5 court seats. In the beginning, we can only fill out 1, and obviously filling out 2 is better. It gives us more special powers from the court, it allows us to cut down on people that can work against us, and so on. We have forced annexation, which allows us to just outright annex a foreign faction, which consists of one region, essentially a city-state. Which I don't think I have to say how powerful that is. We have war games, which says that every 6 turns, we can upgrade 2 different units, 2 ranks. We have competency, which allows us to more efficiently level up our characters, and remote colonization, which allows us to colonize abandoned regions remotely, meaning we don't need to send an army there to colonize it. And all of these powers, with higher legitimacy, becomes much better. So for example, at the highest level, at 400 legitimacy, we can fill out every court position, for example. We can suddenly annex a faction that consists of 3 regions now, and for example colonize abandoned regions much further away. So this is a very special mechanic, I feel, because it really becomes so much better the further in the game you go, and it makes you feel like, the game isn't over when you've just conquered your own region. In fact, you have so much more to go. There's a whole world out there, and using these royal powers makes it that much more fun. One major aspect of the Pharaoh Dynasty update is the Dynasty tree. Shocker, right? This is where we find our family, both our generals, our newborns, sons, daughters, spouses, anyone really, people that are a part of your faction. So let's talk about why the family tree is actually so important. One of the major things in Pharaoh is that we have a dating system. We are currently in the year 1196, as you can see. In terms of characters, that means that now, which contrary to before, characters actually age, and as such, characters may die. Our current faction leader is Prima. He is 59 years old. That is fairly old in these times. That means that at some point in the next 10 to 30 years probably, Priam is going to die of age, unless he of course dies on the battlefield first. This means that we are going to need an heir, and in our faction, Hector is our heir, as you can see both up here, he is the heir, and down here, he is the scion, which is heir in ancient Aegean or whatever, I'm sure. However, we have more than just Hector as our son. We have several sons, in fact. Paris is one, Troilos is one, Helenos is one, and as you can see, we have a bunch of daughters and sons that have yet to come of age as well. But we have something else here too. The character named Deiphobos is our son by blood. However, this little icon here is the icon of the faction Chersonesos, which I'm sure I pronounced correctly, which is not Troy, that's not us. We have sent Deiphobos to Chersonesos in a forced inheritance diplomatic trade. This means that he has been sent abroad, he is no longer a part of our faction, and yet he is the heir of that other faction. In other words, in terms of diplomacy, the family tree is important because we have conducted royal marriage here essentially, but in our favor majorly, since with Deiphobos on the throne of Chersonesos, we have effectively massively improved our relations. Now, in terms of other things, it won't really have that much of an impact. For example, he won't be joining our faction or anything, but of course in terms of diplomatic relations, that is a lot higher now. So if we go to Chersonesos, for example, right here on our border, and they're already our vassal actually from another diplomatic incident, we can see that we are in fact trusted friends, and a major part of that are treaties, but the second largest part is diplomatic marriage, which gave us a boost of 34. However, that also comes with the forced inheritance one, plus 16. In total then we actually gain 50 diplomatic relations bonus with Chersonesos, which is a hefty amount, and will help us with trades and other stuff, even though they currently are vassalized, which also helps, put them under our boots, so to speak. And so this is our current ruling family, including family members that weren't a part of the family to begin with, but which are currently married into us. However, if you want to see the actual dynasty, that means removing the new family, but including the old one that might have moved out, let's go to the dynasty tree. As you can see, most of the people here have this little red icon next to them, and that is because that means that they're related to the faction leader by blood. Now, the people that don't have it are people that married into our family. So for example, Andromache, who married Hector and thus became a part of our dynasty, does not have the blood relative trait, but she is still a part of the dynasty. Now, if we look at Aeneas, he's here and he does not have the blood trait. However, he was adopted into the dynasty. In other words, in Pharaoh now, you can diplomatically adopt people from other factions. or you can become adopted, or have people be adopted from your family into others. This essentially lets you recruit new generals, have other people recruit theirs, and can be used as diplomatic bargaining chips. Of course, also to extend your faction and to, be more secure in the dynasty. However, hyenas also have these two other markers here, because I actually gave hyenas away to another faction in forced inheritance, and so he is now part of Lycia, the Lycia faction, which we are close allies with. Lycia is down here, they're quite powerful actually, so I'm kind of proud of this. And so, just like we did with Chasonisas, we did with Lycia and put our guy as their next faction heir to increase relations and stuff like with the other faction. However, in this scenario, things have developed a bit further. And so, Hyenas is the current faction ruler of Lycia. We are also trusted friends. Here we have another modifier though, the become adopted in the ruling dynasty modifier, which gives plus 25. And that's because we adopted the entire family into the dynasty, so to speak. So if we return to the dynasty screen, we can check here that we are very close to Lycia as a family tree. Their original ruler was Sarpedon, and the current ruler is Hyenas, like we already talked about. In other words, we installed our family member on the throne of Lycia. Again, for a bunch of diplomatic bonuses. And in return from accepting the forced inheritance, they gain legitimacy from being a part of the dynasty. However, we also have the dynasty itself with its modifiers. This is where we can see all the actions of our dynasty and how they add up to define our dynasty, so to speak. We are currently beloved. This means that we are a statesman-like dynasty focusing on very specific things that are not, let's say, warfare, nobility, piety, or shrewdness related, although you can do all of this and your dynasty will be defined by the aspect that you have accomplished the most in. So for example, in statesmanship, we have accomplished 13 points, we have had 2 setbacks, where things have failed, for example, and we have a total of 11 points in this regard. In warfare, it's a lot more nuanced, as you can see. We have 6 accomplishments and 8 setbacks from a bunch of these things that we can see here. So for example, we took heavy losses in Kydonia, but for the beloved factor, we conducted extensive trade with Dionysius, we made 2 allies or vassals for 4 points, but we were also scorned by the people of Thrace, having under 20 influence, essentially culture, in that region. In other words, a bunch of these factors will make and break your dynasty. And more than just being a statesman-like or beloved dynasty as we are here, we also get bonuses based on the points we have. So for example, with 1 point as beloved, we get a minus 20% reduction cost to instant construction, and we get a general minus 10% to regular construction cost. However, since we have 11, which is more than 10, we gain a minus 40% boost and minus 20% reduction cost to construction in these various aspects. And if we had 20, for example, those would be reduced further. In other words, when you do statesman-like things, you really benefit in the realm of construction and city management, states-like stuff. And the other things go for, of course, warfare, piety, etc. And that is essentially the dynasty. In terms of how this works diplomatically though, let's just take a fast look at that. So we go to the diplomacy screen, for example, and then we can do 2 things here. We can simply negotiate with a random faction and then see if they have any people to marry. This faction does not, so we cancel here. But if we go to Ithaca, for example, we can see that they have a marriage button here, and we can request a diplomatic marriage or we can offer a diplomatic marriage. Now, what is the difference here? If we offer a diplomatic marriage, we will essentially offer them the character. So in this instance, if we choose Troilos, for example, to marry Hippoto, this would send Troilos to Ithaca. Notice that there is a marriage evaluation factor here, and this determines how eligible the 2 characters are, and is affected by their character traits. And in this case, Troilos is a devout warrior, and Hippoto is obedient, which I suppose are fairly compatible. However, whereas Troilos gets 3 eligibility from having never been married, Hippoto is a widow and gets only 2 from spouse died. At the same time, Troilos gets 5 points from being young, Hippoto gets 4 points from being middle-aged. In other words, Hippoto is the one kind of bringing the eligibility down here. If we check what this would actually look like in the diplomatic screen again, this has a minus 2.2 agreement, which means that they won't accept this outright. And we can't even make it work outright since, they would require too much, which probably wouldn't be okay for us to accept. In other words, this marriage won't really work. However, let's see what happens with request diplomatic marriage. Now, this means that their family member would join our court. In other words, we would not lose a character, but gain one. And once again, let's choose Troilos and Hippoto. And now the acceptance chance is even lower, minus 4.2, which means that we would have to give them a bunch more resources than last time to even make this happen. And so, you know, this is something that you don't want really. You want this to be either very close to green or above 0 from the get-go. But this is how it works essentially. However, if you don't want to go like searching for like marriage availability, you can just go down here in the right corner and find marriage matches based on female or male matches. So in terms of us, since we have male generals, let's go to females. Let's choose someone that's fairly positive to us. So Taruntasa, we will request a diplomatic marriage and we choose Troilos against some Nasusar. Nice. Here, the marriage evaluation is also 3, but they will accept this outright with a point score of 0.4. So this we can propose right now and have the marriage go through. However, because this is a positive factor, we can now actually ask for more since this is a rather favorable thing for them. So if we want, let's say, some gold or something, just like as a single barter thing, we can ask for a role-play dowry, let's say. And of course, just as we can filter by marriage matches, we can also filter by forced inheritance, essentially which faction would accept such an offer, or even adoption into the dynasty, which, you know, a lot of people really want since it's very favorable to be adopted into the ruling dynasty and, you know, have a chance of better relations, inheriting the throne or whatever, and so on. However, we don't only have to marry by diplomatic means. If we choose Paris here, for example, we can arrange a marriage internally in the faction. If we go down here, click arrange marriage, we have two options here, Tiwatawiya and Muksasawiya. And we can also choose these based on their, eligibility, for example. So while Muksasawiya has remarkable beauty, which has a much bigger chance of having children, Tiwatawiya is obstinate, which has actually a less chance of having children. So if we want children, which, is a big part of getting married, we can pay 50 gold to marry internally in the faction. We can also appoint our own faction heir here when eligible. And so if we had 100 gold, which we do not at the moment, we could appoint Paris as the next heir, taking that right away from Hector over here. We can also divorce characters with enough gold, which we have currently, if you feel like for some reason the spouse is not good enough or you want another one for some reason. And what's interesting is that you can actually also marry your siblings in this game, which is fun. That's something that happened historically, for clout, for dynasty reputation, and for keeping it in the family, so to speak. So if everything else fails, that's always an option, but it should maybe be your last one. And so this is the dynasty mechanic of Pharaoh now. It is extensive, it's a lot of fun, and there are a lot of things to consider. And as you can see, people are having babies, and it's all around a good time. Now, we did touch upon royal traditions before, but I want to talk to you more about ancient legacies. So for example, let's take a character that, again, we choose their path. As Ithaca, for example, Odysseus, we choose the Aegean royal tradition and say okay. And now we have an option up here called Ancient Legacy. This allows us to choose our unique faction path, even though every faction within the tradition here, within the kingdom, will have the option of pursuing either one of these. So for example, I'm going to show you the Aegean royal tradition now. And what's often the case is that you have some options for playing the game more warlike, so focusing on warfare and battle and domination essentially, or you have an option to do so more diplomatically through good relations, through, other means like that. Now, Egypt itself, Egyptian factions come with 4 different royal traditions actually, which is the most in the game. Everyone else has 2 actually. And so for the Aegeans, which is one of 2 new ones, we have Atreus the first Monarchs and Perseus the hero. And in this case, Atreus the first Monarchs is the path you want to go if you want to do the warlike build. Now, the Atreus legacy uses dominance as its main currency. In other words, we have up here gained a new resource, a new currency, which we can spend in diplomacy, in the court, or for power of the crown. Dominance gives us certain powers. When we have 50 of the dominance currency, we can actually destroy a court plot against us for no other resources except for maybe a court action. And of course, if you want to dominate in the court and not have bad things happen to you there, that's a very powerful power. However, the more dominance you gain, the more you can do with it. And if we have 100 dominance, which we have here as well, we can gain a bonus to deal evaluation in diplomacy with weaker factions. This means that we can add 25 bonus points to any deal with a weaker faction. And that allows you to force through quite a lot of deals actually, and it's very powerful. We also gain the ability to make demands at court. And as you can see here, if we had a court action, we can spend dominance and 1 court action to gain the embezzle request or builder wages outright, or any of the other things we can demand here. And that's a big time saver if you think about it. The last thing though is a claim they cannot deny for 200 dominance points. And with this one, you gain a bonus to your legitimacy as long as you partake in a civil war, which means that once a civil war ends, the faction with the most legitimacy is going to end up being the king after all. So this is also a very powerful thing. Now you gain dominance by waging war and performing actions against the factions you are waging war against. So for example, we are currently in a civil war with Mycena, who's challenging our rule. We can see that by defeating their faction leader, by conquering their capital settlement, and so on and so forth, we gain various amounts of dominance points. So for example, in our war against Athalia, we have defeated their faction leader in battle, and we have conquered their capital settlement, which gave us, more than 100 dominance here. In other words, if you choose Atreus as your royal tradition, you must prepare to wage war a lot, because that is the way you gain dominance and power through this tradition. On the other hand, if you chose Perseus for your tradition, you have some completely different powers. Here it's all about creating a bond between different factions. And the most important resource here is the unity mechanic. As you can see, unity is what determines the strength of the bond between the factions and the strength of the Perseus tradition. And here we have 10 unity, which gives us the, lowest of the bonds here. However, even this lowest tier gives us bonuses, and in this case 2+ to global recruitment slots and the ability to host games for peace in diplomacy. Now hosting games is pretty cool. It's like a proto-Olympics kind of. And this allows you to invite factions to the games. You offer them various ancillaries, essentially like equipment that your characters can wear, to whoever wins the games. And in return, you get diplomatic bonuses, you can get peace with other factions, and you can get happiness as well. So for example, here we get the Rite of Perseus, which gave us 1+ happiness faction-wide. And in this game, even +1 has a lot to say actually. But as always, this mechanic improves over time, so with even more unity, we gain more recruitment slots, we gain recruitment ranks, and as you can see here, we can host games for peace with more and more types of factions. So in the beginning, we can only really do it with local cultures like the Danans and the Trojans, but at the top level, we can host games for peace with all factions in the world. And further, the top one here with over 100 unity gives some massive bonuses here. Not just a massive decrease to recruitment costs, but also diplomatic relations bonuses, allows you to basically build an army in 1 turn, and a professional one at that with 4+ rank. And of course, this whole mechanic allows you to recruit units from other factions. In our case, we have no allies, but if we did, their units would show up here, allowing us to recruit them into our own armies. And that's pretty cool, and it makes for a faction which, even though you're not focusing on warfare, you'll have access to a whole range of units, especially as time goes on and as the game continues and you meet completely new factions. So even though we're playing the Aegeans here, imagine allying the Assyrians and suddenly have access to Assyrian units as Greece. Now Babylon begins with the Mesopotamian ancient legacies, and here there is no Atreus or Perseus. We have Sargon the Great and Hammurabi the Lawmaker. But it does kind of follow in the same-ish vein. Sargon the Great focuses on completing grand ambitions, essentially conquering settlements, accomplishing tasks. As you go on, the ambitions become even more complex and you gain even larger bonuses from them. And because of this, Sargon the Great's tradition makes for a very active campaign. On the other hand, Hammurabi the Lawmaker is all about creating laws. Shocker, I know. And so what are Hammurabi's laws in Pharaoh, since I find that this is the more complex one? Well, Hammurabi the Lawmaker uses Kuduru as resources, just like the other things before used unity, for example, or dominance. Now, Kuduru itself can be gained by accomplishing certain tasks, by gossiping in the court, or by completing ambitions that you get organically. But Kuduru is spent in an interesting way, because in terms of laws, they are divided in two, into the military system and the civic system, and Kuduru can be used to increase the rank of either of those. Now, what does ranking do for Hammurabi the Lawmaker? Well, increasing the rank allows you to enact better and better laws with better and better bonuses or negatives. Now, why would you want to enact a negative law? Well, as you can see here, we are currently establishing a second law. We already have one that's army-based, which gives us +6 to both speed and melee defense percentage for slingers. But for this second one, I wanted to go more civic-focused. And as you can see, we have to wait one more turn for this. But that's not how long we had to wait. We had to wait quite a few turns actually. And that's because we actually added some powerful bonuses here. As you can see, this civic law looks a lot more impactful than our first one. Here we gain plus 6% food faction wide, which if we go into the treasury up here, we can see that we are making 2,355 food per turn. Now if you add 6% to that, that's actually quite a lot of food. Which, as Mesopotamia, there's a lot of food around, so you can really make this worth it. We also gain 1 plus happiness from temples faction-wide, and we gain plus 6% stone income increase from mines and buildings. In other words, this law is very resource-based, and I think that's really cool. Just be aware that this focuses on factions that want to take it perhaps a bit slower, that wants to focus on the economy, even though it doesn't have to be that way, since you can focus on military booms as well. But what's very interesting is that Kuduro can also be used not only to level up your rankings here in the civic or military laws, but also to very quickly enact royal decrees. So if we go to the Will of the King here, if we had the points, we could insta-unlock different technologies essentially. It will cost you a pretty Kuduro though, so while the first ones will cost, let's say, 12 or 6, many of them will cost 10, 14, or even 16. In other words, you must balance whether it's more important to you to establish better and better laws faster, or if you wish to spend Kuduro to unlock technologies faster. Be aware though that there are many different aspects to both civic and military here. So for example, we can unlock and upgrade laws in both income, construction, army, and kingdom-based laws. In other words, this makes the Hammurabi tradition, I feel, one of the more dynamic, inward-looking ones, like based on economy, and I think that's really awesome. My only wish is that we could use more than one world tradition at a time, because I feel like these aspects could be generic mechanics that works for everyone, since they are based on what kingdoms actually do. But this is not a review, so anyway, it's a very cool mechanic, and I think that if you want to take it a bit slower in the start, Hammurabi the Lawmaker might just be for you. Those are basically some of the biggest new features in Pharaoh's Dynasty update. But as part of the Dynasty update, and of course what's in the base game as well, are deities, our religious system. Now, Pharaoh approaches religion differently than many other games in the series. Basically, you can choose to pray to individual gods, not one specific religion at a time. This means that once you have unlocked the option to do so, you can worship different gods within your realm. In this case, we are worshipping gods that belong to the Mesopotamian religion, in Shushinak and Marduk, focusing on different things, and as you can see, when we worship them, we also get bonuses related to them specifically. Here, for example, we get upkeep minus 20% for own armies in the region, and these bonuses also improve the better your worship is. Now, what is better worship, you ask? Well, the more favor you have with a god, the better these bonuses get, and you gain more favor by building temples to them essentially, either in cities or outside of them. What's interesting about Pharaoh is that you're not locked to your own native gods. In fact, as you can see here, we have gods from all over the Bronze Age era, from Egypt to the Aegean, and you can unlock all of these as any faction. However, you can only unlock them once you have found them. And in the beginning, Aphrodite, for example, from the Aegean religion, is undiscovered. That means that we cannot adopt her and worship her, even though I know you want to. This makes for a dynamic religious system, which also allows you to tailor your gods to what you want to do in your campaign. For Zeus here, for example, he focuses a lot on resource production, giving the faction plus 10% to wood and food production, which, you know, over the course of these levels adds up to 20% in the end here. Of course, the Mesopotamian Zeus in this sense is Marduk, arguably, who gives plus 8% food income at tier 2 and plus 5 happiness to every province, which is a really nice boost. And look here, he also gives a minus 50% chance to die of old age to devoted generals to him, which can lead to some very long-lasting people, and even makes the devoted general's army immune to attrition. Now, what is a devoted general? Well, if you have the ability, you can devote generals to your gods. Here, we have devoted our faction leader to Marduk, and this puts upon him the bonuses that we have gained with the god. For our second worship god, we cannot devote another general to him until we have unlocked tier 2 with this god. In other words, you really need to devote yourself to the gods you want to worship if you want the best bonuses out of them. And I think it's a really cool system that can be tailored. You can switch gods out when you want to during the campaign, and of course based on which gods are discovered, which will change as the campaign develops and you make it further into the world. Now, what is technology in Pharaoh? Technology is based on royal decrees, which we mentioned already, and you unlock them over time. Now, it's important to to pay attention to royal decrees because they too tailor your faction in the direction you wanted to at various points in the game. So for example, as Babylon here, I kind of wanted to focus on my economy and the country, so to speak. So I began by enacting longer festivals, which gave me a happiness +3 modifier, which is big. I then went to irrigation earthworks, which gave me a +25% food increase to farms on the Tigris and the Euphrates. And then I went to the right here and got the preparation against reprisal decree, which gave us 1+ god dedication slot. That's what allowed me to now worship the 2 gods we talked about before, as you can see here. In other words, royal decrees focus on the civic, economic, or military aspects of your entire realm, and you'll have to decide where you want to go first at every stage in the game essentially. And since they take so long to unlock, at least over time, making sure you have some sort of plan is never a bad idea. Now, for one of Pharaoh's most important aspects, let's talk about diplomacy, which we've already kind of touched upon. If you know strategy games, diplomacy should be pretty straightforward. But diplomacy in Pharaoh ties very much into your economy as well. Because, as you can see here, and let's talk about economy now as well, the economy is divided not into just a gold resource, a money resource if you will, but into different currencies of resources. So food, stone, wood, bronze, gold, and technically whatever else that we have added on to here. So because we are part of the Mesopotamian kingdom, we gain and lose Mesopotamian legitimacy. And in other aspects, as you saw with Troy for example, we also gain dominance up here. But these are the main resources we have to worry about, and which every building and unit revolves around at various points depending on their complexity. For example, if we go to Pharaoh and we wish to build a merchant guild, we have most of the resources needed here, but we also need more stone, which we are currently lacking a lot of. This is where diplomacy ties in, because if we go to diplomacy, a big part of this is centered around the concept of bartering. And you can barter in single barter, so like a single trade of stone versus something else like wood, or through barter agreements, which are longer term trades, giving you a more sustainable way over time to managing your realm's income in terms of resources. For example, we can see here that Ninurta has a bunch of stone and a bunch of food, and thus he's not interested in getting that traded to him really. But he does lack bronze and he does lack gold. Now, we have quite a lot of gold actually. We have a lot of food even though we're losing it per turn right now. But what we have is a lot of wood. Now, if we wanted, say, stone, like we talked about with the building, we can ask for, let's say, 150 stone per turn for 10 turns. Now, making just this trade essentially is gifting the stone to us, right? This is why he's so against that. But look what happens when we add something that he wants. So let's say we want to give him some gold because that's what he really needs. Now how much gold we need to add up, for example, is based on his need and is based on what we have demanded already. Plus also our relations with him. So for example, in this sense, we can offer him 19 units of gold per turn for 150 units of stone per turn. Now if you want to keep your gold, that's possible too, because you can actually trade several resources at a time. So let's say if we only want to trade 10 gold, we have to make up for that somehow. So let's add some bronze maybe. Let's say we'll add 10 bronze. He doesn't really care or not care about wood. So let's see how much wood we can give since we have quite a lot of wood. So we can give him 11 wood, 10 bronze, and 10 gold, which is a mixed bag for 150 stone. And that's something that he'll accept. Now we have a much better income of stone, which gives us a more overall balanced budget, even though we'll lose some gold, for example. This is how the economy works in Pharaoh. And just as buildings require resources to be built, and not just gold of course, but the various resources that you see on display there, so too do units require resources to be recruited. Here, if we wanted the Akkadian militia spearmen, for example, we need not only to spend food to recruit them, but they are paid in food for their upkeep. This means that the larger your army for any unit, the less food you will have, and so your resources has a real impact on how large your army can be, how big your war machine is. And let's talk a bit about recruitment now, because this goes into the economy as well. As you can see here, we can choose between native units and faction units. Native units are units that are native to the land you are currently in. So for example, the Akkadian militia spearmen or the Akkadian militia. However, we can also recruit faction units which are specific to our faction. In this case, the Babylonian chariots. And notice that for chariots, you actually need not just more food to keep them up and to recruit them, but you also need wood. And that's because, chariots are made out of wood. However, we can also recruit special units here if we have the gold for them. In this case, we can recruit elite units, and the Babylonian specialists, for example, they must be paid in not just food, but in bronze and in gold, and they also require you to upkeep them with food, bronze, and gold as well. In other words, elite units are expensive, and you must be very careful with when you buy them, how you use them, and if you actually need them. So make sure that when you recruit elite units, or units at all, since they do tear on your economy, that you know how to use them properly. And perhaps that you will use them soon, since, you know, like I said, it's not just gold that's affected, but every other aspect of the realm. And also your ability, of course, to trade with other factions, to maybe polish up some diplomatic agreements that would otherwise not turn in your favor. A cool new aspect of Pharaoh Dynasties is also your government administration. This essentially speaks to how large your faction is and how much administration costs you have, based on the number of armies and based on certain building upkeep as well. However, it's not all negative in that it's only draining your economy, because as you can see, the larger your faction and the more powerful, the more you pay for it essentially, you also gain bonuses to various parts of the realm. So at the top tier, we gain 30% bonus to movement on land, we gain +3 recruitment rank to all units, and +5 to generals, making it kind of a mixed bag to expand and simulates the difficulties of being a massive power that's super stretched. Notice also that Pharaoh isn't just a free-for-all game, we actually have victory conditions and objectives here. So depending on the victory conditions that you want to meet, you need victory points, and you gain them, for example, from conquests, or from holding certain cities, or from reaching certain feats of rule. So for example, becoming the king of the universe. One of OG Pharaoh's major selling points was the Pillars of Civilization, which is a mechanic that basically determines the state of the world. As you can see, we can find ourselves in different types of civilizations. We can be in the collapse state, which is, apocalyptic, the crisis stage, which happens before the collapse in a sort of in-between where things can go either way, or in prosperity, which the game begins in. As you can see though, we have different bonuses and malices from being in these different times, and while prosperity doesn't really have a malice, the collapse state in fact has bonuses, making for example for better warriors, or increases the resources gained from raising cities. Notice also that we have a chance per turn here of blessings and disasters, and while the disaster percentage is only 3 in the prosperity age, it rises to 15% in the collapse. And so how do you prevent the collapse? Well, as you can see here, you need to stay above 640 points for it to be prosperity times. And you do that by upgrading certain cultural centers, holding them, making sure they're well maintained, and things like that. It's actually very much focused on keeping the important cities of the Bronze Age intact and prospering. If that does not happen, which you're going to see it after a few turns that the prosperity point is lowered, you can go on the offensive, you can capture back those cities maybe and upgrade them. You can upgrade your own centers of culture and thusly increase the prosperity range again, but this is a very dynamic mechanic, and a lot of the time it's going to be completely out of your hands, at least for a certain amount of time. I also want to mention one interesting point of Pharaoh, and that is that we not only control cities here, as you can see in terms of Babylon for example, which now is a one city province, which is pretty cool. We also have outposts, and outposts are essentially small towns in the city's region that you can use to expand in one of different ways. So for example, we talked about devotion to different gods earlier, and here we can build shrines to the different gods to increase our favor, happiness in the region, and more. We can create an economic outpost to increase the production of resources, or military forts and the like to establish a more secure region that will even be reinforced by the units in the fort. All of these cost resources to build, of course, and depending on who surrounds you or who you're bordering, what your plans are, this is an important thing to pay attention to and can really give you a boost in the various aspects you want to focus on. And of course, as a little last reminder here, on the side we have events, we have the generals that you have recruited, we have the provinces you can control, and you can flip around here on the map simple as, we have the known factions directly from this menu, we have reminders that we should maybe complete or look at before the end of the turn, and we have our ambition, which we have enabled when we get the ambition option. And for the vast majority of things, that is how Pharaoh works now. There are a ton of mechanics, both new and old, and I think even though you're semi-familiar with the franchise, Pharaoh has a lot of mechanics that don't really feature in the other games, like the resources up here, the deity mechanics, the new dynasty tree, the court system. In fact, Pharaoh is very different from a lot of other Total War games, and I think in part that's what makes it a lot of fun, especially now with the Dynasties update. And I think that's where we'll end this tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was semi-clear and that, understood what I was saying and going for here. But as always, if you have any questions, anything you're wondering about, then make sure to let me know in the comments. And I hope you'll also leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!